Hey Seawolf community, Chancellor Sandine here, introducing a new video series called Ask a UAA Expert. In this time of our response to the COVID-19 outbreak, I realized that we have a number of faculty here whose areas of expertise are directly relevant to what we're going through now. People with expertise in coronavirus, in disaster preparedness, in economic impacts of pandemics, psychological effects, the history of disaster, and the indigenous perspective. We have that all here and we'd like to share it with you. Part of the mission of UAA is providing knowledge and information and service, and that's what we're doing. So I think you'll find these short, relevant video segments very helpful. Please take a look.
My name is Kevin Barry. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and today we're going to talk about pandemic economics. After previous outbreaks, why didn't the government invest more in preventing the current outbreak? So funding for public health capacity typically acts like a public good. Everybody pays in and the entire world benefits from that sort of self-insurance. We all contribute to the same pot. However, the willingness to pay for that kind of prevention typically responds to the news cycle. So when an outbreak occurs, funding usually increases suddenly for that current outbreak. And the minute cases start to ebb, funding disappears as other things seem more important. Also, there's often misconceptions, like the ability to create a vaccine beforehand. So there's hundreds of thousands of diseases that could potentially make the jump from animal populations to human populations, like what happened with coronavirus. And it's very difficult to pick out which one of those viruses we need to create a vaccine for. And so because of that, we're better off investing in that public good of prevention, a stock of doctors, nurses, laboratories who are able to do testing, contact tracing, and prevent outbreaks when they're still small. Unfortunately, the political will to do that kind of thing is always going to vary with whether or not it's in the news. So one of the important takeaways from the current outbreak is that we should be prepared for the next one, and we should still invest in these institutions even after the current COVID-19 pandemic ends. Does climate change or human activity in general have anything to do with the emergence of coronavirus? So it's unclear if climate change plays a role specifically with the outbreak of coronavirus that we're seeing right now. However, climate change can play a role in the emergence of other infectious diseases by allowing vectors and other species to move around that might be carrying a disease to new locations where people will come into contact with those species, and they could potentially jump from human or from animal populations to humans. However, things like globalization and human activity probably did play a role in the emergence of coronavirus. So globalization makes it possible for an infectious disease outbreak that starts somewhere, like Wuhan, China, to travel across the world fast. And because of that, everybody has an interest in preventing these outbreaks where they start. We have an interest in investing in prevention stocks, testing, contact tracing, and fighting these outbreaks through organizations like the World Health Organization's Global Outbreak and Response Network, and other large public health investments that the United States could potentially make in the future to prevent future outbreaks. What can the government do to avoid a recession, and how does COVID-19 differ from events like the Great Recession? So at this point in time, it's very likely we're going to see a recession as the result of the COVID-19 outbreak. We've seen a negative supply shock as companies are having a harder time sourcing inputs for their production processes as companies in China shut down, and as in general it's becoming harder to purchase things from overseas because of trade and travel restrictions. Additionally, there's been a negative shock to aggregate demand both within Alaska and nationally and globally as people are sheltering in place, self-isolating, and just not buying things like they used to. And also businesses have been shut down by order in various places as cities and states are quarantining. So we're likely to see a recession. However, and I'll talk more about this in a class that I'm teaching this summer and in the fall called Pandemic Economics, there's really 3 steps that governments can follow to help recover from the current outbreak and the associated recession. First, economic policy is not going to be effective until we get a handle on the virus outbreak. So this happens through things like testing, quarantine, isolation, and eventually the development of a vaccine. But these are steps we can take today to help get the outbreak under control, and that will make it possible to follow through with the next step, which is making sure that households and businesses can make it through the associated recession. So a lot of people are seeing their incomes drop as business dries up, either in tourism or oil, or as they're being shut down as part of quarantine orders and other things. And so policy can help float households and businesses through this brief recession. And the last step is that the government can stimulate aggregate demand afterwards to help the economy recover after the outbreak has ended. So this can happen through things like tax cuts, distributing checks, and other policies that basically put money in the hands of consumers to go buy things. So all three of these steps, though, are very, very time sensitive. Because one thing that could happen that's similar to the Great Recession is that we could start to discover that some companies are in weaker financial positions than we expected. They either are carrying a lot of debt, or they don't have a lot of cash reserves, or they're just not able to go a month or two on reduced or no business. And so one of the possible downsides is that if it takes too long to get the virus under control, or we don't sufficiently help households and businesses to make it through the recession, we could see a prolonged downturn as these otherwise healthy companies start to fail.